We're going to begin tonight with our fifth session on the Church of God Mountain Assembly History and Doctrine. And I want to talk tonight about reinventing the Mountain Assembly. Where we left off from our last session had us laying some foundation for the Mountain Assembly. And so I want us tonight to begin to look at the way that the Church of God Mountain Assembly reinvented itself and made the transition, if you will, from the Baptist Association type organization that we were into the more denominational structure that we're familiar with today. And so that's what we're going to talk about here this evening. And we're going to start by just looking at the way in which we made that transition from association to organization. And specifically going to talk about turning the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God into the Church of God of the Mountain Assembly Incorporated. And so we'll talk about that name switch a little bit more in depth in just a moment. But let's first of all, when you think about what a denomination is or what an organization is, there's some characteristics that are more specific to an organization or a denomination than say a loose association of independent churches. And so we'll talk about some of those distinctives and just talk about the Mountain Assembly making that transformation and how you can see it in some of those characteristics. The first one that I want to look at is in the idea of holding common property. And again, we're talking about the shift from an association of locally governed independent churches who once a year meet and talk about common projects or common concerns that they might share, versus a group that is connected on a more regular basis. And just the idea of holding common property, that the organization, that the association owns property of its own. And this begins with the headquarters tabernacle. And we talked about it just a little bit last week, how that by 1922, the Assembly had established its permanent residence in Jellicoe, Tennessee. The tabernacle was erected there on Florence Avenue, and the Jellicoe Church became the headquarters church. And so the picture that I'm showing you is a picture of the original tabernacle. You remember I mentioned last week that there was a balcony that ran all the way around the top of it. You could actually go up and look over the pulpit area. In 1924, discussion turned toward erecting a mess hall to help feed those who attended. And there were so many people that were coming, and we talked about the way that the Jellicoe Church or the host church would be responsible for offering hospitality. They thought, what it would be a lot easier for us to just feed the people while we got them here. And so they talked about erecting a mess hall. Actually estimated the cost of it. The cost of the tabernacle was a little over $4,000. I think it was like $4,129. I'd have to go back and look. You can look in your minute book and find out exactly. But they were talking about the fact that maybe for another $1,000 they could build a mess hall beside of it. And it was discussed for a couple of years before it was finally abandoned. The idea of it was abandoned just because the Assembly's indebtedness for the tabernacle had still not been paid. By 1928, the attendance was good. And the house was crowded at least on several occasions. There were as many people outside as there were inside. The tabernacle just wasn't large enough to hold the people. God bless you. For those 5 days and nights services. Along with this idea of owning common property is the financing of the assembly. How are you going to pay for the assembly? How are you going to pay for the building? At the 1917 assembly, each church was asked to maintain a treasury. Now, it's hard for us to imagine a church not having a treasury today at all, but the advice was given to the church to maintain a treasury, and so we have to consider there had to be a reason that they were advised to. Just many of them weren't didn't have a treasury of their own, but they were advised to begin maintaining a treasury. And at that same year, Francis Marion Thomas was appointed to be the first general treasurer of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. Now, in 1917, the Assembly created this position, general treasurer, and 5 years later, the Assembly created the position of assembly treasurer. There are two different treasurers. It seems that one of them was responsible for receiving the tithe of tithes that were sent to headquarters and paying the expenses of the assembly as an organization versus somebody that handled the money that came in to pay the expenses of the General Assembly. And so there was a general treasurer and an assembly treasurer. Two different treasurers, and the organization would operate with those two treasuries until 1944. Francis Thomas was the first general treasurer in 1917, and coincidentally, he was the first assembly treasurer in 1922, and that position was created. This financial planning included the development of a plan to pay for the tabernacle, the building. We got to pay off this building that collectively we're building together. And so ultimately, what they decided was assessing each church based on the number of members that the church had. And so the first tier started out from 7 to 17 members and ended up, going up to where if you had over 75 members, so that each church was asked to pay an assessment, if you will, a tax on the building of the tabernacle based on how many members that they had. So anywhere from $4 at the lower tier up to $26 at the upper tier to help pay for the building. The Assembly also adopted a tithe of tithe system in 1917. There was a ministers' meeting held at Pleasant View in December of 1917, where this was spelled out and then was adopted at the 1918 Assembly. But the idea was that a tenth of a person's income should be paid into the local church, and then out of all of the tithes that are paid into the local church, that the church treasurer or deacon would take 10% of that and then send that to the general treasury, and that would help to pay for or to fund the expenses of the General Assembly. In 1928, they added to that a personal assessment. I mentioned just a few moments ago that each church would be asked to make a contribution that was based on the number of members they had to go toward the indebtedness, the outstanding indebtedness of the tabernacle. But in 1928, in order to help with the expense of the General Assembly, bringing people in and the expenses of the utility and the expenses of feeding the people and anything else that would be related to conducting the General Assembly, in 1928 they adopted a plan where that each member of the local church was asked to pay 50 cents to help to bear those assembly expenses. And then after that, they were asked to send $1 a year, but for their assessments. Those assessments would grow They would change over the course of the years to where at one point it was $3 a year. I remember hearing stories about some treasurers or deacons that would go around to collect the assessments and that would collect them on a monthly basis, 25 cents a month, for being a member of the church, so that at the end of the year, their assessment would be paid up. They could send that in. It finally topped out at $5 a year, and it was $5 a year for a long, long time. And that assessment would be sent in prior to the General Assembly to help with the expenses of the General Assembly until sometime in my lifetime. I forget how long ago this was. I'd have to look it up. But we eventually did away with the assessment, and now each church is asked to take up an offering the last Sunday night of June and send that offering to headquarters for the expense of General Assembly.
This assessment, what necessarily did it do that they did away with?
The purpose of the assessment was that it helped offset the expense of the General Assembly. So that when the assembly was in Jellicoe, at the Tabernacle in Jellicoe, the utility bills obviously would be higher in August. You had expenses of cleaning supplies and toilet paper and things like that. Well, the assembly for a long time operated a restaurant in the basement of the old Tabernacle. So there was a lot of stuff up front that would have to be paid. They always tried to give a donation to the rescue squad for helping direct traffic in and out of the parking lot for the services. If they had to rent PA equipment or anything like that. The idea was it's expensive to hold a convention, or it would take money, and so they would ask each member of the local churches to pay $5 each year toward that expense. Now, obviously, they're taking up offerings at the assembly also, and those offerings, might bring in, depending on the size of the crowd, but at least two of the offerings would go to something specific. For example, youth night, mission night, those offerings would go toward those projects. It got to the place, and the reason they changed it and dropped the assessment, it just got to the place where so few pastors were asking their members to pay that money, or if you did ask, you didn't get much of a response from people. Their membership dues, if you will. The response was so little, so few churches were participating that somebody submitted a resolution and said, let's just take up an offering, and whatever free will offering we get, we'll send it in. So the bylaws specify a free will offering on the last Sunday night of June, and I don't think headquarters really cares when you take the offering up. If you get a better offering at another time, then basically, and now of course it's expensive to conduct the General Assembly in Pigeon Forge. There's not offerings that come in. The office is out, headquarters is out. Even with those offerings that come, even if every church sends in a good offering, you get 100 good offerings, you're still not going to pay for the expenses of it. But every little bit helps, and so that was the purpose of it. And that the change in the system, the idea is still undergirds that. It helps to undergird that cause. That answer your question?
Right.
Another thing about holding common property is the requirement for the assembly to have trustees, people to look after and to hold in trust the property that is deeded to the organization. And so in 1920, the first trustees were appointed. Francis Thomas, George Ford, and Jake Taylor were the first three who were appointed to receive the deed of any property that the assembly might hold in its trust, and to look after and to care for that property. In 1923, there was a question asked, during the General Assembly about what should be done where outsiders come into our church houses, break the locks, take possession. And so it was recommended that each church, each local church, appoint 3 trustees to care for the local church property and to make sure that it was in repair, and that the assembly would also have 3 trustees to look after the properties that it holds the deeds for. And those trustees in 1923 that were appointed were Kurt Walker, Stephen Bryant, and John Parks. And, they were a committee that were appointed to appoint the committee. The trustees were Gilbert Weaver, John Shepherd, and J.T. Richardson. The idea was you really want, ideally you would want trustees who were living close enough to the property where that if you needed to do something with the property, they could be there. If they needed to sign paperwork, then they were local, or if something needed to be done, a decision needed to be made, then you'd have them at your disposal. In 1925, there was a legal dispute that arose over a building in Harlan, Kentucky. And I don't know all of the details that are from the dispute. It ended up going to court. And the dispute was between the Church of God of the Mountain Assembly and the Church of God with headquarters in Cleveland, Tennessee. And because our name, our legal name when we were incorporated in 1917 was the Church of God, or the Churches of God, and the legal name of the other group was the Church of God, there was some confusion about and a dispute over the piece of property itself. Now, the Church of God Mountain Assembly, when it met at the General Assembly, said the local church needs to take care of that, and the Assembly's not going to get involved. But at the same time, we recognize there's the potential to have some conflict over property. And so in 1928, it was moved in order that the local churches, or the local trustees of each church, send their deeds to the assembly trustees, and move that the assembly trustees place them in a safety vault at First National Bank in Jellicoe for safekeeping. And so the recommendation was that each church would deed their property, that the local property would be conveyed, by a warranty deed to the trustees of the Church of God Mountain Assembly Incorporated, and that those deeds would be kept there at headquarters. And so, again, this idea of owning property is one of the things that is one of the evidences you can see where the transition is taking place from an association of independent churches. We all have something common. There's something we all have a vested interest in these properties. Now, I mentioned the old tabernacle, the first tabernacle, and the fact that it was filled. Within 6 years, there were reports that there were as many people standing outside as there were inside. And so right away it became apparent that there was a need for something to be done. And by 1941, that the tabernacle had been filled to capacity and overflowing for more than a decade. And finally there was some discussion about remodeling the tabernacle or building a new one there in Jellicoe. And so finally the decision was made to rebuild. And in 1942, the assembly opened up in the new tabernacle. And I've got a picture of it from in the mid-80s. This is the front view. I wish I had a better side view. I know I have some pictures. Finding them last night was a bit of a challenge. Looking for to just show you the difference. This is the tabernacle that was in use from 1942 through 1965, and at that first assembly in 42, it was filled to capacity before the week was over. They had already filled it up. John Parks attended one of the services there, standing up as if to give his nod of approval to the new tabernacle. It would be his last assembly, as fate would have it, if you will. But holding common property is one of those things that helps us to see how we were making this transition. And let me talk about this idea of moving the transition. We'll give you a few more of those examples, but just again, seeing the transition from independent to dependent churches. And I told you, you remember last week in the first session when I talked about the Baptist mindset is that each church is autonomous. We're locally governed, congregationally governed, that this church is not dependent on any other church. We take care of all the business that needs to be taken care of. And so the mindset of that association of independent churches transforming itself into a group that really, in a lot of ways, is dependent on one another is what we're trying to show you the examples of. Now, I want to talk about the significance of the name. I mentioned last week when we talked about the transit as far as identity is concerned, how the name helps us to speak about who we are. It talks about identity. And, the name was changed. And we talked about some of the nuances of that. And I mentioned that there was a transition that took place in the minutes, where the minutes had made the change from the minutes of the churches of God, or the Mountain Assembly of the churches of God, to become the minutes of the Church of God of the Mountain Assembly. And so this transition took place in 1943, 1944. In 1943, it's the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God. And in 44, it's the Church of God, Mountain Assembly. Church of God Incorporated, Mountain Assembly in parentheses is what the minutes bear. So this changing mindset from plural, the plural churches, to the singular church. In American history, we talk about the United States of America before the Civil War. The United States of America is a plural. It's when you talked about the United States, you talked about those United States. You'd say the United States are what have you. And after the Civil War became singular, the name of the country singular, where you'd say the United States is. And so the same kind of mindset is taking place in the organization in the mid-40s, where instead of a group of independent churches, we start seeing ourselves and thinking of and using the terminology of a single church. We talk about membership between congregations. And still to this day, when a person joins the Church of God Mountain Assembly, they're joining that local church. I'll talk about the church covenant in a session of its own. Before we're done, we'll talk about what membership entails and talk about the strength of the covenant and what have you. But the covenant that we use is the idea is when you join the church, you're joining that local congregation, Middlesboro, Kentucky, or Ferguson, Kentucky. You're joining that local congregation. It is connected in its association. It's connected and dependent on the other churches within our fellowship. And we start seeing that become more pronounced in the 1920s. Whereas before, your membership in one local church had nothing to do with what was going on in any of the other churches that might be in your neighborhood, in your particular geographic area, or even within your association. But 1921, it was moved in order by the assembly that each local church shall have the final decision as to excluding their members. So that it's up to the church to bring in members, it's up to the church to dismiss members. And with that, it was also moved in order that by this assembly that each member that has been excluded shall first be reconciled to the church that excluded them before becoming a member of another church of the same faith and order. So in other words, if you got into trouble or what have you, were dismissed in a local church within the Church God Mountain Assembly, before you could go join another church, you had to first be reconciled. Our churches began to think of themselves outside of the local congregation and started thinking about their responsibility to each other. That if somebody caused trouble at the church down the road and were dismissed, they were disciplined by that particular church, they were excluded from that fellowship, they couldn't just pack up their stuff, go to the church down the street and join that church and be in good standing in that church without having first made things right in the church where their offense was created. So you can see this is an entirely different mindset from totally autonomous churches, where yes, the church has the responsibility for receiving and dismissing its own members, but at the same time, you can't go down the road and join another church within our fellowship, within our association, our organization, that without first being reconciled to that church. We see the same concept in the case of offending pastors. There's a provision added in 1921 also, that it should a pastor be guilty of bad conduct or false doctrine, that the church had the responsibility of calling him to order. If your pastor has had a moral failure, your pastor's preaching a contrary doctrine, it was the church's responsibility to call him to order. Now, if no ordained minister was present, they were given the instruction to call upon 2 or 3 ordained ministers from the sister churches to assist them. You know, if you call a door and say, hey, you're preaching wrong, maybe the deacons or the church gets together, says what you're doing, your conduct is unbecoming of a minister, or what you preached Sunday was not in the Bible way. If he accepted that and repented, then the church could work together in harmony. Otherwise, you see the church start thinking outside of the local congregation, in that they were given the opportunity to call on ordained ministers from other churches, to call them together, 2 or 3 in a group, to serve as a counsel to help assist them and to in correcting an offense. Also in the 1920s, there was a provision given for churches that had less than 3 male members to call upon neighboring churches in order to assist them with a transaction of business. Now, why is that important? Because in the 1920s, we did not allow our women to speak in business meetings. We did our churches, coming out of the Baptist tradition, the men made the motions and made the second. The men transacted the business in the church. Women in the church might have been allowed to vote. They might have been allowed to participate in church business by voting, but they weren't allowed to speak and discuss and put forth motions. So if you had a church where there was a small church, didn't have a whole lot of members, then the provision was given to borrow members from a church that was nearby. A few men could come over and help to transact business that needed to be transacted. Now, I'm sharing that not to condone or to condemn the idea of women speaking in business. That's not the point. The point that I'm making is we see that churches are starting to depend on each other, rely on each other. So they're starting to think outside of a local church, where that transition from independent to dependent churches, from association to a denomination. Another thing that took place during this same time period is we see the beginnings of a church calendar. You know, the association had been meeting on an annual basis. You get together for 1 week of meeting, might have a few church services, transact the business that needed to be transacted for the association. And then other than, you know, maybe having a revival here and there where you might invite one of the brothers to come and preach, or you might have, if they're close enough, they can come over and attend a revival service with you. But there wasn't a whole lot that took place as far as the association was concerned, except for that annual meeting. But in 1915, the assembly began having ministers' meetings scheduled throughout the year. They started out scheduling 3 ministers' meetings every few months. They would meet together, and so that you would, on a quarterly basis, meet together in fellowship. And sometimes these meetings included the transaction of business that had the same significance or the same effective power as you would if you were meeting in the General Assembly. So the churches were encouraged, the ministers especially were encouraged to attend these ministers' meetings. Come quarterly and be together for fellowship and and to transact any particular business that might need to be transacted. And so,
I was just going to say, so basically with these minister meetings back from 1915, it relates to what we see in the minutes now about like ministers and district meetings and stuff that's required quarterly, that we meet with our district overseer. That basically it's that same order of business.
And to some degree, yes. And geographically, you know, as the assembly expanded and grew beyond the Whitley County, Campbell County area that it originated, as the assembly expanded up and down Dixie Highway, it got harder and harder to get together on a national basis. So yes, those statewide camp meetings or district-wide revivals, district fellowship meetings, kind of took the place to some degree. But at the same time, we still see a national calendar where that throughout the course of the year, and now the calendar includes a lot of different things. You know, we've got women's meetings that take place and men's meetings that take place, and there's youth rallies and youth camps and a camp meeting in Florida where the elders have an elders meeting. And so the idea was, on a regular basis, we're still getting together more than just at the annual meeting. And so yes and no, in some ways, the district model accomplishes the purpose of fellowship in a local area, but you're not likely to have representation from everywhere, or like you would at say a youth camp or at Florida camp meeting, at the elders meeting. And so again, anything that causes the churches to be connected to each other in a way that just a local independent church wasn't connected, is what we're seeing take place in the 1910s and 1920s and into the 40s. But here's another one more thing that I want to point out on this particular slide, and that is the issuance of credentials. In 1911, the assembly, on motion and second, that we give all the ordained ministers of the assembly a certificate from the Mountain Assembly of the Churches of God. So as early as 1911, we begin recognizing that we need some sort of a certificate from the assembly that endorses a man's ministry. And I know the subject of credentials is probably well beyond the scope of just this one class session. That's an interesting topic, maybe for another time. But the idea is, in the local church, a local church can ordain a preacher. And they had, and that was in the Baptist mindset. The Baptist church, the local church, always has the authority to ordain ministers and deacons. That's in their mindset. And they can print a certificate from that local church signifying that this person has been ordained. But in the 1910s, we start seeing in the first 5 years of the association's existence, we start seeing them think outside the local church. We're going to issue credentials, not that they're credentialed just from Saxton or from Little Wolf Creek, but a little broader appeal. Nowadays you can get credentials on the internet. I mean, just any one of us in the room can probably have a license within the hour, for that matter. But the legitimacy of those credentials, are going to be on what's behind them, who it is that's issuing them. In 1925, a motion was made that we actually print or have struck some ordination papers, and the number that was suggested, we're going to print 500. Doesn't that sound ambitious? We're going to print 500 certificates for ordination. In 1927, we moved that we ordain no man to the ministry that doesn't belong to the church and don't believe or stand for the doctrine of the church. And so again, there's a connection to the local church and a connection to the association itself. 1936, the assembly ordered a seal to seal those credentials with, and all credentials not bearing the standard seal of the Church of God Mountain Assembly were null and void. Let's talk about the emergence of a denominational polity. Another way that we see the transformation from association to organization is in the emergence of a denominational polity. In the early days, they would get together in the association and they would transact business. They might have several resolutions that they all had in common. But those resolutions, when the assembly was over, what have you, there was no effect. There was no effectiveness. Nothing standing after that assembly was over. And so in 1915, the assembly that year created the first standard resolutions. They went back through the previous minute books to determine which resolutions to retain. And so they looked through the minute books in 1907, 11, 12, 13, and 14 and pulled out the resolutions that would be best for the churches. The idea is these are going to be the standard resolutions that we continue to hold to that exist or that last beyond that one time. It wasn't just a one-time act. So we start seeing the emergence of something that resembles modern bylaws, a constitutional declaration, a form of government. And so that when we talk about a denominational polity, that's what we're talking about, is a government. We see the first standard resolutions. And along with that, 1917, a covenant and articles of faith. We talked about that last week. And by 1925, the minute book each year carried forward all of the valid resolutions. And so you'd start seeing printed on an annual basis all of those standard resolutions. Pick up any minute book and the bylaws or the governing principles or policies of the Church of God Mountain Assembly are printed in there on an annual basis. Another thing that signifies that transition, and we see it in this idea of a denominational sense, a denominational government, is the idea of standing officers. Now, initially, in the Baptist Association, the moderator was elected at the beginning of that session, and he served as the moderator for the session. The clerk recorded the minutes for that session. Now, there might might be at the beginning of the next year, the last year's moderator might be the one that opens up the session and conducts the election or receives the motion, what have you, to appoint a new moderator. And the clerk might be the one recording, and then they change places or what have you. But the idea was that all of the officers that were appointed, all the committees that were appointed, they transacted their business for that week. You know, the resolution committee, for example, is the oldest committee that we have. And, you know, it's the oldest committee. We had a resolution committee at the first assembly. The resolution committee's job during the week of the assembly was to consider and to bring forth, to write, to draft resolutions and to present them to the assembly that week for their consideration. And their job, when the assembly was over, their job was over. You know, they were done. The week's over, and so our job is over. And same thing with the Committee on Divine Services. When the assembly was over, there weren't any more preachers to call on to preach, and so the work was done. And so in the association model, there are no standing officers. In a denominational model, there are. And in 1912, the assembly elected its first standing committee. 1912, it was a committee on Sunday schools. Kurt Walker, Pete Huddleston, Francis Thomas, William Hicks, and J.F. Norman were the first Sunday school committee. Their job was to stimulate interest and to promote Sunday school work. Now, a lot of our churches at that time didn't have Sunday schools. And so the work of the Sunday school was, the Sunday school committee was important work, teaching others on the importance of it, developing Sunday schools, how to prepare a Sunday school and organize a Sunday school. And we decided this is something you can't do just during the week of the assembly. If we're going to have a Sunday school committee, their job is going to exist beyond just this week. They're going to have to go to churches and help these churches. And so the first standing committee was a committee on Sunday schools. In 1915, the assembly appointed its first evangelist. And you see, an evangelist obviously is going to do more than just during the week of the assembly. You know, he's going to get out and conduct revivals. And in 1915, Henry Mobley was the first evangelist appointed by the Church of God Mountain Assembly to serve as an evangelist, to go and to preach into our communities and into our churches. The following year, he was reappointed, and in 1960, we actually discussed the possibility of the assembly purchasing a tent so they could conduct tent revivals in the places where he went. In 1922, there was a committee that was put together to work out a solution whereby the letters that come to the assembly could be gathered together. Now again, in the early days of the General Assembly, the first 15 years, when you came to the assembly, you brought your letter with you. The church brought its letter listing their messengers, listing their pastor and their clerk, the number of their deacons, their ordained ministers, their membership. They brought those letters with them. Someone would read those letters publicly, and that lettering in, you joined the association. In 1922, they said, you know what? This job of reading these letters, putting these letters together, would be so much easier if we actually came to the assembly and had them already put together. We might even be able to print them ahead of time, and so that it would facilitate this business. And so they asked each church to send their letter to the clerk. So again, you can see the clerk's job doesn't end when the assembly is over, and even when he prints the minute book. But he's going to be counted on the following year, but in a month or so prior to the General Assembly, of receiving those letters and putting them together to present them in a matter of business. 1924 and again in 1925, the assembly chose as its evangelist the moderator Stephen Bryant. And so we see that the moderator is going to do something more than just conduct the business during the week of the assembly. They actually wanted him to travel and be in the churches and preach in the churches and evangelize. You know, a little precursor to what we're going to see later on with a full-time general overseer. In 1933, the assembly voted that the moderators of the assembly, the moderator and the assistant moderator, serve as our evangelists, and that the tithe of tithes will furnish them with their traveling expenses. They wanted each church to be visited, and the church would take them up an offering, or if they were able to help them defray it with their expenses. But the assembly was going to undergird some of the expense that was associated with, again, this model is not at all like the model of the Baptist Association. The moderator is becoming someone who during the course of the year is having some influence and is providing some leadership to the organization. Actually made a motion that the moderators do not pastor churches that year, but spend their time visiting the local churches. In 1934, let me back up. We'll talk about standing officers. One more thing that I might mention. In 1934, Stephen Bryant had been the moderator for that previous year, and the question was asked on how we're going to vote on officers. Up until that time, typically the vote would be something like this. I make a motion that Stephen Bryant serve as our moderator and that John Park serve as our assistant moderator. And then likewise, I make a motion that J.C. Taylor be our clerk. And so one person made a motion, and then typically you would vote on that motion, and whoever was put forth in a motion, they may be the one to serve. And so by 1930, we're talking about a little change of government, a change in polity. They decided that year that instead that the voting on the election of officers would be limited to ordained ministers along with ordained deacons, that they would vote and that they would openly nominate the moderator, the assistant moderator, the clerk, and the assistant clerk, and then the vote would be taken up secretly. And so for the first time, 1934, we had open nominations where multiple people are nominated, secret ballot vote, and the majority vote getter was the one that was elected. And that first year, coincidentally, John Parks was elected moderator. It's the only year that he ever served as moderator. Stephen Bryant declined. He cited health reasons, said that his health was poor, and he just didn't have the stamina to travel like they wanted him to travel at the time. Let's talk about also a limited delegation. 1924, question was asked, how many messengers from each church, how many messengers should be allowed from each church? And so the assembly requested that each church limit their delegates to 3. Prior to this, any number, and it wasn't a rule, a hard and fast rule set in stone. It was a request, so that one church didn't dominate, the discussion or dominate the business or what have you, but to limit their request to 3. In 1929, the order was made restricting each church to only 3 lay members along with their ordained ministers. So you were allowed, 1929 became a law, you're only allowed 3 delegates. We'll talk about how that changed a little bit. Let me talk about the elder board. In 1919, the assembly appointed 12 brethren: John Parks, Stephen Bryant, Newt Parks, Kurt Walker, Kim Moses, Levi White, Joshua Baird, George Ford, James Goins, and Henry Mobley, Sterling Smith, and John Thomas, to the office of elder, and their purpose was to plan together with each church as far as our work will extend. And their work shall consist in keeping the churches in progress. They shall have the right to call meetings with any church for any cause to investigate the conduct of pastors or churches in case of a question that may arise. Should either of these 12 brethren depart from the faith, then the remainder are able to add to their number so that the work can go on. And so you see that the idea was we're going to turn this, in some cases, the control of local churches, what before would have been the choice of local churches in dealing with grievances or discipline issues or what have you. Instead of local church handling that, the elders have the right to come in and make decisions and steer that church in the right in the right direction according to their wisdom and discretion. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago that about the transition in an offending pastor. As a response to what I just described, the elders' role was, the churches said, you know what, the churches need more authority, it still ought to be the church's discretion, and if they need help, they can call on neighboring ordained ministers to come. And so this plan that started in 1919 was changed in 1920. Said, you know what, maybe there were some issues in local churches where it didn't work out and what have you. But they changed that. But in 1921, there was a move to drop the elders, to release the 12 elders. And I'm sorry, it wasn't the following year, it's 2 years later. And that each church, should have a meeting each month and transact their business and just like in the case of offenses or what have you that I described, then they can call on somebody else to come to their aid. And I'm sorry if I'm being confusing tonight because I'm trying to watch the clock. In 1922, following here, at a ministers' meeting in April in Williamsburg, there were several men that were asked to write on the work of an elder. They were given the task to write what is the purpose, what is the work, what is the job of an elder. And John Park, Stephen Bryant, Henry Mobley, George Ford, and Starling Smith were the five that wrote their article, their opinion, on their essay on what the job of an elder was. They brought those manuscripts, they brought those reports to the General Assembly, and they were read at the Assembly that year, and there was a question asked on whether we should have elders or not. And so the committee that year that they put together reported that it was in the best interest of the Assembly to have a board of elders to fulfill the role that was described by the men that read their report. So the vote was taken on the committee's report, their endorsement of the idea, and 57 were in favor and 14 were against having a board of elders. And so the question was asked, who all is qualified to be an elder? How many feel like you're qualified to be an elder? And everybody that felt like they were qualified to be an elder stood up. And there were 13 men that stood up attesting that they were qualified. And so Henry Mobley and S.N. Bryant were selected as a committee to choose the elders. And they chose 6 of those 13 men to be an elder board. The following year, there was a move in order that we appoint 12 elders as servants of the assembly or churches in case of necessity or questions, and their duties should be to look after the interests of the said mountain assembly, and the said elders shall be subject to the orders of the said assembly. And so we go back to a board and so there are 12 guys, 12 brothers, 12 men who were appointed that year to the elder board. 1924, the 12 elders who were selected in 1923, their duty that was outlined into looking after neglected churches, to make sure churches have pastors, to inquire about ministers who hold credentials but are not pastoring, why they're not doing something. Euless would appreciate that. Why have you got credentials if you're not out there pastoring? And then each elder was required to report separately to the assembly on their word. In 1926, there was a motion that the 12 elders hold quarterly meetings throughout the year so that they can conduct and transact business that might arise. In 1930, I want you to see that we talk about the elder board was created in 1919. But the elder board that was created in 1919 is not the same thing as the elder board was in 1921, not the same thing it was in 1923, not the same thing it was in 1926. That the role and the job of the elder was constantly changing through those years. And even sometimes it was a temporary, we voted this year to have elders, and next year we voted, we don't have elders anymore. We took their authority away. In 1930, and since 1930, every year since 1930, we've had an elder board. And that year, John Parks and S.N. Bryant and Kurt Walker were appointed to the Board of Elders. The three of them were made elders, and they were given the power to select 9 other qualified elders to make out the full number of 12. And so the assembly appointed 3 and then said, you guys pick the other 9. And so they chose C.L. Price, J.B. Spears, Emmy Woolham, A.J. Long, Thomas Woods, William Sharp, Drew Stanifer, John Bryant, and Lewis Baird. And so they became the Board of Elders. And that has been a position that has not had a limitation. It did not have a limitation of office as long as they were in good standing. Now they could be removed for bad conduct or poor health, or as sometimes they would be. But the idea was it was almost like a Supreme Court justice. You were there, you were appointed for life. And so we see the beginnings of a denominational form of government with the emergence of these offices, something a little more regular. I'm going to skip over this portion of the denominational periodical, and I'll come back to it at a later time. I actually intended to come to it and talk about the Gospel Herald at a later time, and for time's sake, I'm going to skip that right now. But I want to just say this because it relates. The creation of a denominational periodical, having a monthly letter, or a monthly newsletter, was one more thing that helped to bring the association together into, we're more than just a group of independent local churches. Now granted, any independent church can get a subscription to any magazine that they choose to. Church members can subscribe to Reader's Digest. But that don't mean everybody that subscribes to Reader's Digest is part of the club, or everybody that subscribes to. But the idea of a denominational magazine, a denominational newsletter, signifies more than just, we're all part of something. We're reading about what's going on. We're keeping in touch. What a church calendar can't do. Even if you meet 4 times a year, what you can't do in those quarterly meetings, getting a monthly magazine, a monthly newsletter, a monthly paper that's reporting on you're reading sermons, you're hearing church news, you're seeing testimonies. That does a lot to bring the organization together in a way that a lot of other things could not do. And so I'll try to highlight that a little more when I come to that. But I want to talk about a new system of government, and really this is I'm going to spend the last 15 minutes of this session talking about the new system of government, because more than anything else, when the Assembly's form of government changed, that's when the transition from association to organization, that's when we became a denomination. You know, we were an association, a loose association of independent churches, in 1907, and that transition, and maybe there are some times you can say, well, this helped. I can see the beginnings of this, but the new system of government was a denominational form of government. So I want to talk about that. Just a little background, and mention the influence of the Church of God cannot be understated. The Church of God's influence can be seen in the financial system, the tithe system that we developed in 1917, 1918. There was a ministers' meeting in 1917 in December. Is basically a copy of the Church of God's tithe system that they had instituted in January at their General Assembly that year. And the same thing is true about the elder board, and maybe the challenge behind our board of elders was we were trying to copy a model from the Church of God that just didn't work within our particular ecclesiology. But the idea of having a board of elders, again, is something that we borrowed from our friends down in Cleveland. Another thing that again, the influence of the Church of God is seen in just in the unity of the organization. The ecclesiology of the Church of God in Cleveland is such that there is one church, and it always has been. There's one church, and you might have multiple congregations, but you're all part of that one church. And at the top of that was A.J. Tomlinson, the Pope, if you will, of the Church of God. The general overseer has a general oversight of all the churches. But if you joined the Church of God, you became a member of the Church of God. And you were standing in the General Assembly. And that was true no matter which congregation you might be at this particular Sunday. We're all part of the Church of God. And so we begin to see that influence, that mindset. And the more we associate with the Church of God, the more that mindset is beginning to develop in some of our men. Now, the question is asked, well, Brother Paget, we talked about the attempt at merging that didn't happen. Why didn't we merge? Well, we never formally, as an organization, merged, but many of our men have been going that direction since very early on. Jonas Shelton was one of the first to make the transition. He was in that meeting in 1912 in Cleveland. Was one of the messengers that attended representing the Mountain Assembly, and he ended up becoming a part of the Church of God shortly thereafter. But in 1922, G.A. Fore was elected to serve as moderator for the assembly. J.L. Goins was his assistant. Starling Smith was the clerk, and Francis Thomas was the assistant clerk. Now, Francis Thomas was also the assembly treasurer. I mentioned that earlier in the session. The four of them were elected to what is now our executive board, the executive officers. These four men were elected to the Church of God, and shortly after the assembly, G.A. Fore and Starling Smith and F.M. Thomas left the Mountain Assembly and joined the Church of God in Cleveland. So 3 of the 4 officers who were elected in 1922 joined the Church of God. And of course, in the preface of the minute book, they're still listed as having served in those offices at the General Assembly. But John Parks has an editorial note where he talks about the fact that they had left, and it was their choice, and that they were gone, and that they left the assembly in a pretty rough shape. Now, J.L. Goins was the only member of that executive board that did not leave the assembly that year. But 3 years later, he asked for a letter of recommendation from the Mountain Assembly at the General Assembly, and they granted him one, and he joined the Church of God. And so all 4 of them, within 3 years, would become members of the Church of God. Now, Goins, by the way, perhaps more than anybody else who ever made that transition, made a larger impact in the Church of God than anybody else up to that time. He had served as a state overseer, and it seemed like he maybe been on, served in an executive capacity. I'll look that up and try to let you know more about that. But for a long time, I think he died in 1971. It served in various departments, doing mission work, in an important part. So you think about where the assembly might have been had some of these bright, promising young men not made that transition, but there they were. Let's talk about again. We're talking about this new system of government. Talk about the passing of a generation. 5 years after the first assembly, at the age of 39, George Daniel Cadell died. He's the first delegate from the first assembly to have passed away. Just a couple of years later, Thomas Higginbotham, who had been the oldest delegate at the first assembly, died at the age of 70. In the first 15 years, by the 15th annual assembly, by the 10th General Assembly, at least 15 of the first 51 delegates had passed away, including Alan Moses, who you remember played such a pivotal role in the committees and the organizational planning of the Assembly. Let me talk about a few other individuals. Thomas DeBerry Moses, born September the 3rd, 1856, and died June 10th, 1928, was saved about 1893. Was baptized by John Parks, ordained to preach the gospel of Jesus in 1898. He died in 1928. Newton K. Parks, the brother of John, born October the 13th, 1858, died November the 10th, 1936. He pastored two of the churches during at that first assembly. He'd served as assistant moderator for 4 years. He was also one of the 12 elders the first two times that elders were appointed, and died in 36. Stephen Nathan Bryant was born July the 30th, 1887. He was elected moderator in 1908, continued to serve until 1922, and then again in 1923, from 1923 to 1934, and then for a third time from 35 to 39. A total of 29 years that he served as moderator. 6 different men served as his assistant. And so he's one that his leadership was looked to, his ability to conduct a meeting, his preaching ability, his personality. He was a member of the Board of Elders for more than 20 years. He pastored multiple churches and was obviously an important part, one of our founders, if you will. And then John Hansford Parks, born July 5th, 1861, called into the ministry while a young man in his 20s. In his nearly 60 years in ministry, baptized nearly 600 people. He served as moderator 1 year. He was the assistant moderator 6. Was on the board of 12 elders 24 years. Pastored at least 6 churches. And preached over 20 times at the General Assembly, including the first sermon at the First Assembly. And he died in August 7, 1943. As this generation is passing away, and a new generation is going to take its place, then you can see that the change is going to be inevitable. The transition that's taking place it can't be. The change is coming, whether you want to or not. Let me talk about the new generation. I'm going to talk about 5 men, just mixing them that are very important as part of this second generation. First one is John Harrison Bryant. Now, it's almost silly for me to call John Harrison Bryant a part of the second generation because he was a delegate at the First Assembly. He was the youngest delegate at the First Assembly, along with his father and his grandfather. He was ordained in 1925. He pastored 6 churches, including the Whitley City Church, for more than 40 years. At the death of his father, in 1939, he was elected that year as the assistant moderator. And he was a member of the elder board for 35 years. John Harrison Bryant. Andrew Johnson Long born August the 21st, 1892. To John Long and Sarah Lay. John Long was a delegate at the First Assembly. James Lay from the same church at Zion Hill is probably a cousin of his mother. And so he has a connection by blood to that First Assembly. But also, he married Desi Silcox sometime around 1914, the daughter of Andrew Silcox, the first moderator. So his father-in-law was the first moderator, and his father had been a delegate at the First Assembly. Long began pastoring in the 1920s. 1928, he served as assistant clerk. In 1934, he was elected to serve as assistant moderator under S.N. Bryant. When Bryant died in 1939, A.J. Long was elected moderator. He guided the assembly during the construction of the new tabernacle. And he served as an elder for 17 years. It would have been longer, but we'll get to that. John Edward Hatfield, born April the 30th, 1904 in Woolridge, Tennessee. 1923, graduated as valedictorian from Jellicoe High School. Completed business training at a business school in Knoxville. 1930, he was saved, sanctified, baptized with the Holy Ghost, and baptized in water by John Parks. He joined the Church of God Mountain Assembly that same year, felt the call of God in the ministry, and was ordained in November 1931 by J.H. Parks and Louis Baird. 7 years later, he was elected to the Board of Elders and served in that capacity for 38 years. He was the founding editor of the Gospel Herald in 1942 and was its editor for 25 years. He also served 3 years as assistant clerk, served as general secretary and treasurer under 7 general overseers. Pastored a number of our churches. John Hatfield died in 1981. Luther Gibson, born in Chenoa, Kentucky, January the 18th, 1914. His ministry of 52 years affected the lives of so many people. Joined the Church of God Mountain Assembly at Fondee on August the 30th, 1930. Ordained January the 4th, 1936 by Dave Hammett and Jimmy Longsworth. He pastored many churches. Henderson Grove, Stanfield, Kenford, Kentucky, Jellicoe, Tennessee, Dayton and Sidney, Ohio, and Trenton, Michigan. He was instrumental in organizing the churches in Troy, Pickle, Greenville, and Salina, Ohio. In addition to pastoral work, he served the organization as general overseer for 3 years, assistant overseer for 10, mission board chairman for 3. He was an elder for 33 years, preached at 24 assemblies, and was the author of the assembly's first history book and edited also the second edition. Andrew Clayton Lawson, born July 14th, 1910 in Knoxville, Tennessee. He was saved in Cincinnati under the ministry of H.D. Williams, ordained in 1936, pastored in Sydney and Cincinnati, and Ohio, and Covington, Kentucky. He's the only man to have served in all 4 executive offices of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. He served as general overseer for 14 years, assistant overseer for 3, general secretary and treasurer for 2, assistant clerk for 2, was a national evangelist for 2 years, and was an elder for 43 years. He's one of 4 men to have preached in all 3 of the tabernacles in Jellicoe, and he preached at least 29 times during the General Assembly. Take just a good look at these 5 men, this new generation, these 5 men. These 5 men are among the most important men in the history of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. You got to know something about them if you hope to do well on the final exam. These 5 men, certainly, if you took the top 10 most important people in the Church of God Mountain Assembly, these 5 are among those 5. I point them out because of their importance, and also because these 5 men were appointed at an elders meeting on September the 5th, 1944, right before the General Assembly. They were appointed a committee to plan a new system of government for the Assembly. And so the following day, the committee presented their proposal to the delegation at the opening of the General Assembly, and this new plan would change just about everything. The first major change dealt with who would make the major decisions. The proposal called for a bishop's council that would meet on Tuesday before the General Assembly began on Wednesday. The bishop's council was ordained ministers, and the ordained ministers would be the ones who would be the lawmaking body of the assembly. They would elect the officers. They would elect all the officers of the General Assembly. And so the elders and the ordained ministers would become the bishop's council. Also, there were some changes made to the executive offices. Instead of a moderator, the assembly would have a general overseer. And the general overseer's duty would be to look after the general interest of all the churches, keep a record of all the ministers, and moderate the General Assembly. He'd be allowed to pastor one church, but his travel expenses would be paid by the assembly. The committee also proposed to change the office of clerk. The clerk's duties were combined with the duties of the assembly treasurer and the general assembly, or the general treasurer, to create the office of general secretary and treasurer. And so the general secretary and treasurer became the clerk and the treasurer of the assembly, and assumed both treasuries. The assembly created a finance committee that would audit the treasurer's books and authorize expenditures, and devise a means for increasing the assembly's income. Along with the general overseers, each state would have an overseer. And the state overseers were to look after the interests of their churches in their state, keep a record of the ministers, report monthly to the general overseer, and the state overseer would be required to report to the assembly and basically detail the work within their state and work with within their bounds. Another change, the Board of 12 Elders was retained, but its nature changed. And the Board of Elders would become the judicial body of the assembly. They would have the final decision on any dispute that was brought to them. There are also some changes that were made to the assembly's polity. The standard resolutions were amended. There was a new and revised order of business presented. There were 34 separate changes that were proposed in the standard resolutions. Among those 34 different changes, 25 resolutions were totally omitted. 7 were revised, and 2 were moved to the teachings of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. And so on September the 7th, 1944, the delegation voted to receive the report of the committee with all the changes, additions, and deletions as presented. In just 48 hours, a brand new organization was born. A.J. Long was the general overseer. Serving him as the assistant overseer was Clayton Lawson. J. Hatfield was the general secretary and treasurer. And I know what some of you are saying, those 3 are the guys that were on the committee. They were creating jobs for themselves. Truth of the matter was, they were probably going to be, Hatfield had already been the clerk, and Long had already been the general overseer. Truth of the matter was, these men were going to serve, whether they were serving in positions that they were created or not. Ira Moses was elected as the assistant general secretary and treasurer, and the new state overseers. Kim Moses was the state overseer of Kentucky, Luther Gibson, Tennessee, Roy Cornelius in Ohio, Morris Woolham in Michigan, and Thomas Woods in Indiana. And so these new officers, the creation of a new organization was about to, here in the mid-1940s, was about to launch us into the rest of the century, and we'll talk about what happened when we come back. But does anybody have any questions? I'm about 5 minutes over what I wanted to be, but anybody got any questions about before we take a break? All right, let's take about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll go on to the next subject. Ready to go? Let's talk about rebuilding for the future. We just finished a session where we were talking about the new form of government, that new system of government. So let's talk about preparing ourselves now for the future. And of course, I'm talking about their future from 1944. Let's talk first of all about the new polity. New polity, new problems. This is the new system of government. Change always brings conflict. Change always is hard for people to deal with. Even good change is sometimes difficult. It's the same way with us as parents. We watch our kids. We watch our kids change. We watch our kids mature. We're excited about that when they take their first steps or when they say their first words. That's always exciting. Then they won't shut up, and we can't get them to stop. Can't get them to sit still. And so it's a double-edged sword. Change is necessary, but it always has the potential to bring conflict. Change brings division. Let me. And I'm using a phrase that comes from a book that I read several years ago, and I may think of the author's name here in a little bit. But the Reformation didn't fix everything, and that's the phrase that I'm using as a throwback to the Protestant Reformation. There was a lot of things that were fixed by it, but there were still a lot of things that didn't get fixed. And so let me talk about just in this context of the new system of government and the fact that there were still some challenges that remained. One of the biggest challenges to the Church of God Mountain Assembly was in the absence of a tenure of office limitation. Now, I talked in that last session about the fact that we lost some good men, some promising leaders and what have you, to the Church of God, and don't, it's not fair to say that they didn't have opportunities in the Mountain Assembly. I mean, GA4 was the moderator, for crying out loud, right? I mean, it's not like you have anywhere to go from, but up. You're in that position of great leadership. But there were we had by the 1940s we had a great number of capable men who did not have the opportunity to use their gifts. Now I mentioned at the end of that last session about Stephen Bryant, about what a capable leader that he was and how well liked that he was, and even though when he had the opportunity to be an evangelist, and the assembly asked him to also serve as an evangelist along with being the moderator, even in that capacity, the office of moderator was still a position of limited influence and limited leadership. You might use that position, you might have a good idea and whatever, use your position because you're up in front of people and whatever to throw that out, but you're certainly not a dictator. You're certainly not in a position to say this is how it's going to be. You pretty much, your role, at least on paper, is limited to conducting the business at hand. And so there's 51 weeks of the year where your influence is not really any greater than maybe somebody else. But the change, with a general overseer who takes a general oversight of all the churches, is a different dynamic than what the assembly had been faced with before. And so there were men that had vision, men that had ideas. And that without a tenure of office limitation, we talked about how the election procedure had changed. I mean, in the past, if you were the guy that somebody said, I nominate, S.N. Bryant to be the moderator, a lot of times that was just one guy, one man's motion put you into office, put you in that position. And sometimes those elections or those appointments were conducted without even so much as a secret ballot vote. And you were the only choice in the matters, either him or nobody, right? But that changed a little bit in the 30s when there was open nominations and multiple people were nominated, and there was an election and a secret ballot election. Those kinds of things all changed. We talked about change being such a challenge. Sometimes just the idea of change scares some people. And so they're comfortable. Many people are comfortable with the same leadership that they've always had. Always know what they're, always know what we've always had, always know what to expect. And so through a tenure of office, where a man is limited to a number of terms, you had two choices. You could either run against the guy that had been serving, who was popular and well-liked, and you could either run against him, or you could just sit around and wait till he died or got tired of the job. I mean, it was one or the other. And so again, the new system of government didn't fix everything. Let me say also that whether a man's vision or a desire for office, a man's desire for office, a man wanted to be general overseer, whether that desire was primarily motivated out of a God-centered vision, a real burden and a call, or whether it was motivated by his personal ambition, wants to make a name for himself, stroke his own ego, regardless of the motivation, the lack of tenure of office limited a man's ability to serve. You understand what I'm saying? So it really didn't matter whether he wanted it for the wrong reasons or he wanted it for the right reasons. That lack of, if a tenure of office limitation is in place, God knows, you know what, I just have to wait 4 years, or I just have to wait 6 years, or whatever, and then everybody's going to get their turn. I'll just wait until it's my turn. Another issue that wasn't fixed, if you will, is we were still having elections annually. And so annual elections also provided for ample opportunities. If the only chance you had of becoming, of getting an office, of being elected to something, if the only chance you have is to run against somebody, then the potential is placed there for, on an annual basis, I'm going to get the chance to throw my name out there. Annual basis, I'm going to get the chance to run. And those annual elections provided ample opportunities to undermine a man's influence if you wanted to run a candidate against him. And I know we shouldn't be talking about politics in the church, but the truth of the matter is, there has been, and sadly there always will be, politics within local churches, within the association, and within the denominational leadership. There's always going to be those opportunities for politics. One story has survived to the present time, saying that in 1946, some delegates even brought with them cards urging delegates to vote for their candidate. Vote for. That people were passing out cards suggesting who to vote for. And so, I'm sorry.
They were lobbying.
Well, yeah, exactly. When the assembly was in Jellicoe, we'd come to Jellicoe every year. We always came to Jellicoe, that first week of August, right about the time that the elections were getting ready to take place in Campbell County, the local elections. And so when you came into town, there were political signs up all over the place. I mean, voting for this guy for treasurer, this guy for magistrate, or this guy for sheriff, or whatever, all over the place. And so, it never would have surprised me to see, vote for so-and-so for general overseer, because they were just, the political advertisement was all over the place. And so there were, and I just want to say that with the new system of government, there were still some issues that were at hand that contributed to the problems that the assembly was going to face. Another thing that before I get to the split, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, I have to talk about the spiritual work that was taking place in the mid-1940s in at least some of our churches. Almost all of the conflict in the mid-1940s in the churches, I'm talking about spiritual conflict, can be traced to a single woman. And by single woman, I'm not talking about she was unmarried. Not just one lady. One woman who because of her husband's job, I'm assuming, and the coal mines moving you around from coal town to coal town sometimes, she was connected to at least 4 different churches: Henderson Grove, Jellicoe, Fondy, and Middlesboro. And so that no matter what church she was a member of or what church she was a part of, her influence lingered in each of those churches after she was there. What happened was there were home prayer meetings that started in women's groups. And oftentimes these home prayer meetings that were conducted in some of the sisters' homes, the gifts of the Spirit would be in operation. And I'm using those terms with quotation marks because as you will see, the idea is which spirit we're talking about is the issue. But they would pray, and at these meetings a lot of times prophecies were given, or words of knowledge, or words of wisdom. Things were said where that they would write down the prophecies and then take them to church, at the next church service, and then give them out. And so a lot of times people were being called out. Something that happened in a home meeting or what have you would manifest itself in the church service where somebody was being called out. Now, somebody that was close to the situation told me that it really seemed like that if they didn't like you, you were a prime candidate to be discerned or to be called out, or what have you. And so a wide range of things might be brought up in those prayer meetings or in those services, and this kind of spiritual activity, it caused a lot of problems in the churches where it took place. And largely because oftentimes they totally miss the mark, And the Holy Ghost, the real Holy Ghost, is never wrong. He's always dead on. And so I want to tell one story in particular, and I know there are probably many, many others, but one story in particular that I'm the most familiar with that illustrates the point, and I'll share it with you. Cordell Parton was a member of the church at Fondy, Kentucky. And on May 25th, 1944, he was drafted to serve the United States Army in World War II. And so Cordell was a mild-mannered, pleasant young man who had a real devotion and passion for God, loved God with all of his heart, was a man of good character, lived right. As a matter of fact, when he went to basic training, he wrote letters back to his mother. He had a 12-year-old little brother at home. Had several sisters. I think there was 5 or 6 girls in the family, but he had one little brother who was 12 years old, and he would write to his mother, and he would tell Mother, is Willie being a good boy? He had always asking about his little brother, and he would also tell him, tell him to go to church, and he would also encourage him, not to go to the picture show and some of those other places in the world to do what was right. But he was a man of good character and good morals. Drafted into the service, was sent to Indiana for basic training, as a medic. He did some medical training. Cordell was a conscientious objector before there were such a thing, I guess, or before they were, that phrase perhaps got popular in later usage in some later conflicts and wars in U.S. history. But he didn't believe in killing. And let me say this too. At the time, the Church of God Mountain Assembly's official teaching was, we taught against going to war and killing. That was our teaching. And we'll talk later on in the session on our doctrine, when we get to this doctrine section, about how that transformed into what we currently teach. But at the time it was thou shalt not kill, and that's what we adopted in World War I, and that was still in stance. We taught against going to war and killing. And so he didn't believe in killing, and so he would not carry a weapon. His commanding officer explained that his convictions were so deeply rooted in the sovereignty of God that Cordell believed that if God wanted him to live, that no enemy could take him out. And that if God wanted him to die, that no weapon could save him. That's just how he felt. And so he was trained in first aid. He was a company aid man and was trained in administering aid to the wounded. I want to say that when he left his last church service at Fondy, Brother Rowe remembered that Sunday night service. And of course, at the conclusion of the service, they had special prayer for him, and they sang a song, and my memory has escaped me now to who suggested singing the song, or even what the name of the song was. I know that it wasn't "If We Never Meet Again This Side of Heaven," but it was a song similar to that vein. And somebody rebuked, the one that suggested that later on. After, "What'd you sing that song for? That's sad. You made it sound like something's going to happen to him that he ain't coming back." But he said, "That's just what the Lord laid on my heart, because we never know what the future holds for any of us." And so that Cordell left the church in good standing, went to serve in the U.S. Army, and in May 1945, a year later, he joined the 32nd Infantry Regiment on Okinawa and was assigned to a rifle company as company aid man, administering aid to the wounded soldiers. His commanding officer would say about him that he was well loved by everybody that was in the command, that he was good at his job, that he was self-sacrificial, that he always above and beyond to help whoever that he could, and that he did a good job ministering to those that were wounded. On June the 8th, 1945, while going to the aid of a wounded soldier, he was shot and killed by an enemy sniper. Now, just a day or so later, the telegram reached the hills of Fondy, Kentucky, where Cordell's father, Jim, was working in the coal mines. And the owner of the mines, the boss man at the mines, got the telegram, and he called Glenn Rowe, one of the local preachers out of the mines, who was working beside of Jim. He called him out to break the news to him and asked him if he would tell Mr. Parton, give him the telegram and tell him the news that his son had died. And so, as you might imagine, Jim took that sad news home to his broken wife Mary, and they were troubled about this. Now, almost simultaneously, at one of these home prayer meetings, a prophecy was given that the Partons need not despair, but be encouraged that their son was still alive. That the telegram was mistaken. That Cordell was not the one that died, that he was still alive. And so the church began praying earnestly for the return of their church member, and revival broke out. They went to church every night praying for his return, and revival broke out. Now, just a few weeks later, as was the custom, the first arrival on news like that would be a telegram just stating that he'd been killed in action. But a few weeks later, a personal letter from the commanding officer providing more details than the telegram reached the Parton home, and again shared with them that sad news and about how much he was missed by the company. But again, the prophets dispelled such notions. Cordell was coming home. One prophecy suggested that he was so close, I can see the buttons on his uniform. Another one ensured that he was coming home to answer to the call of God, that God had spared him, and that God was going to make a preacher out of him, that he was going to hold a revival, and that all of his family would come to know the Lord through his preaching. And so this was the two conflicting news stories, if you will. One from those proclaiming to speak for the name of the Lord, and one speaking from the government's sake. Needless to say, when his body arrived early in the spring, it brought a sad end to the hopes of the family and an abrupt end to the revival. You know, people were wounded in that church and hurt in that church as a result of that. I'm familiar with this story. I'm familiar with this story because I know the family, and I know that Jim was now Mary, Cordell's mother, never lost her love for God, her passion for God. The whole ordeal sent her to the Lord. Jim was angry. He was mad. He was mad at God, was mad at the church, and for the longest time, thankfully, thank God, that just before he died, his heart was softened and he gave his heart to the Lord. I want to say, too, how thankful that I am to have been able to pray with the little brother Willie about 10 or 15 years ago when he came, prayed, and gave his heart to the Lord in our altar. I thank the Lord. I thank the Lord for that. But so much church hurt was caused by things just like this. In all of at least 4 of these churches where these prophecies were given, I know of families and marriages that were broken up, churches that were split because of this kind of spiritual work. One more anecdote from the church at Middlesboro. Apparently, there was a preacher at Middlesboro at the time, and I don't know his name. I know it wasn't Pastor Otis Ellis, but there was a preacher who at least was preaching revival, or who had come there some, that somebody got the impression, perhaps the woman behind all that, but one of the sisters got the impression that he smoked a pipe, that he was using tobacco, and that he was keeping that hidden from the church. And that he needed to be exposed for that and called out. And so during, and I heard the story when I was a teenager. Didn't know it was from the church that I now pastor, but I heard the story when I was a teenager that she would say something along the lines of "yay pipe" in one area of the church and moved her way right up to where the preacher was, and she could see it. She discerned it. It was in his suit pocket, and she could see it bulging out. He was carrying that pipe around, and so in the middle of one of those spiritual fits that she was in, she reached in and pulled it out, and it was his toothbrush. And so, needless to say, that those kinds of issues obviously taking place in a public worship. And Otis Ellis was a young man at the time, a young pastor, and Otis was at his wit's end, really didn't know what to do about it. And so Otis decided to appeal to the general overseer for help. The general overseer's job, this is 1946. In 1944, the general overseer's job, the moderator became the overseer, and the overseer's job was to take general oversight of all the churches. And so he went to the general overseer on a Sunday night, went to Fondy, where A.J. Long was pastoring, and pleaded to him for help. I need you to come to Middlesboro, sort this out, help me with this, and help me fix this. I don't know what the official reaction was, and I'm not here to lay blame or even to. I'm not here to placate or to condemn. I will say this: this trouble was going on in Jellicoe, and this trouble was going on in Henderson Grove, and this trouble was going on in Middlesboro. This trouble was going on in Fondy, in the church that A.J. Long pastored. And it could be that he didn't know how to fix it where he was at, much less go and fix it somewhere else. But for whatever reason, the appeal to help from the overseer fell on deaf ears, and maybe A.J. Long couldn't help, and so he didn't do anything at all. But let's come to the 1946 General Assembly. In September of that year, the first order of business was the report of the general overseer and the assistant overseer. A.J. Long and Clayton Lawson gave their reports. When the time came for the nominations for the overseer, A.J. Long was nominated, and Clayton Lawson was nominated. There was a motion on the floor to challenge the nomination of A.J. Long for overseer, as it is reported that he is out of order. There are no details that A.J. Long had not done. I told the story of Middlesboro, and I know that at least Pastor Otis Ellis had appealed for some help, and his help was not resolved or didn't come to him. I know at least that much. And so my conjecture is that on that grounds, that was part of the evidence that was used against it. And again, there may have been others that needed the overseer, and for whatever reason didn't feel like they got the overseer to come and help them out. Did you have a question?
So the trial was about if he was fulfilling his role as overseer?
The trial, what I mean by the trial of Andrew Long in this slide is that the charges were being presented against him for not fulfilling the new assembly government, for not doing the job of the general overseer. And so the delegation voted that day and found him guilty of not fulfilling the duties of the assembly. You'll have to read the 1946 Minute Book for your homework for this week, and you can see the reaction that took place. But during the course of the day, the floor was reopened for nominations, and J.H. Bryant was elected general overseer. And I know some of you say, well, you just said Clayton Lawson had been nominated. How come he didn't run? And it may be at this point in time that the whole assembly felt like that the son of S.M. Bryant might be the best choice to try to guide the assembly through this transition that they were getting ready to go to. Because as a reaction, Andrew Long left the assembly that week, along with Kim Moses and several others. They left the business session of the assembly and did not come back during the rest of the meeting. So J.H. Bryant was elected overseer. E.D. Bryant was elected assistant overseer. J. Hatfield and Ira Moses stayed in office as the secretary, treasurer, and assistant. There were a lot of preachers that left, including 4 members of the elder board. Kim Moses, Andrew Long, Joshua Baird, and Lewis Baird left the assembly as a reaction to the change in overseers. And Kim Moses and Joshua Baird, by the way, were 2 of the first set of elders that were elected. Gary, do you have a question?
Yeah, this is just basically all speculation. Now, with Andrew Long, the way that he would have probably reacted to the whole incident that put him on trial, that could it be, since the general overseer is what used to be the moderator, he just assumed that could have been his duty just at that time in that week, that he knew he wasn't going to be reelected. He was just to moderate at the assembly and probably just didn't have the discernment or wisdom beyond that as the general overseer.
That it was more a misunderstanding of the duty.
Right.
I think that's entirely possible. And my thing, I'm not going to criticize anybody for not wanting to get involved in the hornet's nest that these churches. Right. He was pastoring the church at Fondy. He had his hands full, I'm sure, on his own because of these issues.
I'm not passing blame on him or anything.
No.
But I'm just saying that could it be a lack of knowledge to his duty that he, we say dropped the ball there in the court?
I think that that's a possibility. At the same time, he's also one of the ones that was on the committee that drafted this new system of government. Now, just because you're on the committee that drafts it doesn't mean that you're totally for it either. And so we're going to talk about that too. So it may be that he didn't understand the duty, and it may be that he wanted the system of government to go back to the way to the way it was.
And
So-
that's kind of like what I'm getting out of this though, with everything that we're seeing on the board and that you're talking about, is that maybe he had a misunderstanding of his duty, and then when Bryant was elected, that he left the assembly.
Yeah, right, and that certainly is possible. They well, several left the assembly that we. Now let's talk about the Church of God of the original Mountain Assembly. Just a few weeks later, at Williamsburg, Kentucky, on October the 4th through the 6th, 1946, A.J. Long and Kim Moses and those that left the Assembly of Jellicoe a few weeks earlier met in Williamsburg for an assembly, and the 40th, the 40th assembly, if you will, and in their understanding, this is the legitimate assembly now. We're going to meet, and we're going to do it right. At this meeting, the old system, or the original system, was reinstated. The Church of God of the original Mountain Assembly has its name because what they were saying was, we're going back to the original Mountain Assembly. We're going back to the way that it was from the beginning. We're going to go back and undo what we did 2 years ago. We're going to go back, bring back the original covenant. I'll talk more about the covenant in a little bit, because through the years we dropped the last paragraph of the Old Baptist covenant, and so the original Mountain Assembly went back and added that last paragraph back, went back to the original Articles of Faith from 1917, went back to the original offices of moderator and assistant. So A.J. Long became the moderator, and Kim Moses became the assistant moderator. Paul Grubbs was the clerk, and Bert Bray was the assistant clerk. There were 40 ordained ministers that became a part of the Church of God of the original Mountain Assembly. 40 ministers. Of the 9 churches formed in the first 10 years of the Church of God Mountain Assembly, 4 left with the original Mountain Assembly. 1 was split. So we're talking about some of the oldest churches being divided on the issue, and one of the congregations being split. And in all, 12 churches left, and as many as 8 churches were split.
Out of how many?
I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. You'll have to look at your 45-minute book for reference to see the number of churches and the names. Some of the issues. If you talk to the men who were present and who were involved at the time. Now, granted, I had the advantage 25 years ago of talking to men that had first-hand knowledge, of some of these things. There are very few men who were at the 1946 assembly, either in the one in Jellicoe or the one in Williamsburg. There are not a lot of them left. Not a lot of them left around. There is one that comes to my church every once in a while, though, that was there in Williamsburg. His name's listed as one of the messengers. He was there with his dad. But there's not a lot of people that are still around. But there's a lot of people who had family that were connected. A lot of people whose dads, a lot of our preachers whose dads were in the middle of these situations. And most of what, and of course, depending on in which assembly you were a part of, your perspective obviously is changed by the experience. But those that are able to stand back and look at it, everybody that was involved is good people. Everybody that was involved is good people. And the people who left the churches because of the spiritual work. One of the charter member of our church, that I talked to about what was going on in Middlesboro. Of course, her husband died roughly around the same time while she was pregnant with her 6th child, and she had other issues to be concerned about with other than just, the most important thing to her was not it was not the spiritual stuff that was going on, but she was able to tell me that, and the people that I've talked to that know the others, everybody was good people. Some of them were they got caught up in the excitement, they were confused by the spiritual work. Some of them didn't know any better, just lacked discernment, what have you. I am told that the lady that kind of started all of this, that she later on ended up spending some time in an asylum. The truth of the matter was, she probably had some mental illness, and not poking fun or anything. Today we would recognize her problem as a mental illness, and probably even be able to prescribe some medicine that would take care of some of the issues that she had. These are all good people. They're all good people in the Church of God, Mountain Assembly, and the Church of God, the original Mountain Assembly. And let me say that a lot of the people that left in 1946 would come back in the next decade or so. And through the years, there have been a lot of people that have come back to the Mountain Assembly, and now the Church of God, the original Mountain Assembly, still exists. There's still some local congregations. I don't know how many congregations there are. They still have an assembly. It's not anything at all like what it was in the 1940s. They're all good people, and you say, well, we're bigger than they are. We were right. I don't think that's probably the truth of the matter is that there were probably some wrong spirits on both sides, and the truth of the matter is people in both sides probably got in the flesh a little more than they needed to. I want you to look, and I want you to think this week and one of the assignments is asking you, to read the events and just ask yourself, what could have been done to prevent it if it was preventable, and what is there a different course of action? Here's the thing: change always brings conflict. Change always brings conflict, and big changes always bring big conflict. And that's the heart of the matter. With the original Mountain Assembly, it was a matter of preference to go back to what we started with. There was nothing wrong with what we had. Let's go back to, we talked about the influence of the Church of God. We copied a model from the Church of God. The Bishop's Council, Church of God. The overseers, the general overseers, Church of God. The state overseers, Church of God. We copied a model from the Church of God. And I told you from the beginning, the biggest difference in the Church of God and the Church of God Mountain Assembly is in ecclesiology. We started out as independent churches, congregationally governed. We're autonomous. We're sovereign in and of ourselves. That's the way, and that mindset was still prevalent 40 years later. Even those ministers, some of the ministers that I mentioned had already passed away. There's still plenty of people who were around 40 years earlier. They've been here, been part of this. There's still, this mindset is still, I'm part of this local church. I want to go back to the association style of government that we had. Not so top heavy. It's as old as the division between Republicans and Democrats, right? The issue is, how much involvement do you want the government to have in your daily life? That's with all politics. That's the challenge. Let's go. Let's talk about rebuilding for growth and following the vision of new leadership. And look at some significant changes that would take place in the years that followed. Now, in 1946, James Bryant became the general overseer of the Church of God Mountain Assembly. He served for 1 year. Remember, these are annual elections. And perhaps the tension, the conflict of trying to keep this thing, maybe it was too much for him. Maybe he didn't want it to start with. And he thought, he thought, out of the respect that everybody has had for my father, he may have felt like I'm the one maybe to keep this thing together at a time when we feel like it's falling apart. But he'd served for that year. In 1947, the assembly voted to have a full-time general overseer. The general overseer would not be allowed to pastor a church, but would devote full time to the office and would be paid a whopping salary of $65 a week. The assembly would provide him living quarters in Jellicoe, Tennessee, and then give him 5 cents a mile on his travel expense. So that year, the assembly elected 33-year-old Luther Gibson as general overseer, the youngest man to ever serve in that capacity. Harvey Rose became his assistant overseer. Luther Gibson wasted no time in his full-time office. Within the first month of his election, he had visited 9 churches. Of the 35 churches in the assembly, he visited 32 of them his first year as general overseer. 2 years later, 1949, the assembly said, you know what, this full-time overseer is not really something we need. We're not really big enough for that. And so they discontinued the full-time overseer, and Luther went back to pastoring the Jellicoe church and served another year as general overseer. And let me say this. In 1949, at the end of the assembly year, I mentioned this last week, they would always vote on where to have the assembly at. They did that until they built a tabernacle, and when you build a tabernacle and then build a second tabernacle that's bigger, you don't have to vote every year where you're going to have the tabernacle. You build a building for that. The tabernacle in Jellicoe was already full. The first week of the first assembly in the new tabernacle in 1942, the building was full by the time the week was over. And so in 1949, at the end of business, somebody made a motion that we have the assembly at different places. And that motion passed, and so they voted, let's have the assembly. Somebody made a motion, let's have the assembly in Cincinnati, Ohio. And so they voted to have the assembly at the 15th and Race Street in Cincinnati, where Clayton Lawson was pastor. It's the year that, and Clayton had the women of the church preparing meals for the delegates and fed them all. Clayton Lawson hosted the assembly in 1950. The picture that I had up earlier, you look at some of those pictures of Clayton from the 1950s. Look in the 1950s. Look at the pictures in Luther's book. And, the pictures that are available of Clayton, you'll realize what kind of man that Clayton was. Clayton believed that the preacher, he believed in a professional clergy. That the preacher ought to look like a preacher. Everywhere he goes, everything he did, Clayton wore a suit and tie everywhere he went. He just thought that the ministry represented the church, it represented Christ, it represented the greatest of professions, and that you ought to always neat and respectful. To many, he was the finest representative the assembly could have. To others, he was proud. There, right? That year in 1950, while the assembly's in his home church, Clayton Lawson was elected as the general overseer. The assembly also made a change in 1950 where the elections would be held biannually. We'd have elections every 2 years instead of every 1. And they changed that election procedure not just to the assembly's offices, but also to the local churches. And so pastors, for the first time, were elected to 2 years instead of every year. And I don't have time to talk about the dynamics of a local church where you have a pastor's election once a year. Along with a 2-year term, in 1950, the assembly also voted to have a full-time general overseer again. Clayton Lawson would not be allowed to pastor a church, devote full-time to his office, and he would be paid $75 a week. 2 years later, we dropped the full-time office again. Well, no, we're still not big enough for that. In 1954, the general overseer became full-time again and has continued to be full-time ever since then. So since 1954, we've had a full-time general overseer. In 1954, he was paid $90 a week. In 1951, the assembly approved a salary for the general secretary and treasurer for the first time. For his work with the treasury and his work with the Gospel Herald, he would be paid $10 a week. Again, it's still just a part-time job. 5 years later, a committee was appointed to devise a plan for financing a full-time general secretary and treasurer. Morris Wallen, Luther Gibson, and Johnny Douglas developed a plan where the secretary and treasurer would receive a salary of $75 a week, and he might live in the general overseer's parsonage as long as the general overseer didn't need it. They would allow him to pastor a church, but that he would also be required to maintain regular office hours at headquarters. So you can pastor, but you got to pastor somewhere close enough that you can still be in the office for regular hours. So we've had regular office hours for the general secretary and treasurer and had a full-time position ever since then. At the 1958 General Assembly, the delegates also approved the salary for the assistant general overseer, $50 a month. Luther Gibson was serving as assistant general overseer, so he became the first man to receive a salary for that office. Another significant change that took place during this time, in 1946, the assembly began issuing evangelist licenses for ministers. Prior to this, the only credentialing we had was for ordination, ordained ministers. So in 1946, we recognized not everybody's going to be an ordained bishop. Well, licensed preachers, a licensed minister could baptize and could administer the Lord's Supper, but could not pastor a church unless it was an emergency situation. The following year, they changed that and said, you know what? He's allowed to pastor a church under the direction of the state overseer. And now the district overseer.
What year was that?
1946 is when we first started licensing evangelists. And in 1947, they were allowed to pastor under the direction of the general overseer. 1952, more changes were made affecting the form of government. We got rid of the Bishop's Council. Decided, you know what, this copying the Church of God, it still works for the Church of God, but not so much for the Mountain Assembly. So we got rid of the Bishop's Council, went to a General Council. The General Council is composed of all licensed and ordained ministers and appointed delegates from the churches. And each church will be allowed to appoint 2 delegates. So since 1952, the General Council has consisted of 2 delegates from each church, along with the licensed and ordained ministers. In order to make sure that our ministers understood our polity and understood, and it was clarified, Clayton Lawson submitted a supplement to the minute book in 1959. 2 supplements. One of these was a section that gave the basics of parliamentary procedure, so that our ministers understood, enough about parliamentary procedure to conduct business meetings in their local church and to participate in business at the General Assembly. And then the second part of that was a supplement that dealt with the powers and duties of the local church. I'll talk about the transformation of both of those at the end of our course. Let's talk, again, rebuilding for the future. Let's talk about three areas in which, the 1940s saw us trying to rebuild for the future. And the title of this section is More Than Just Adult White Men. Recognizing that in the future we're going to be required to incorporate some diversity and some inclusiveness into our leadership. I want to talk about the CGMA and race. In 1924, our church in Kenford, Kentucky, Pastor H.M. Bates presented a church letter from a church in the colored camp in Kenford. I use that word, try not being racist, I'm using that word quoting from the minute book of the time, just connection of the times. The African American community in Kenford, in the coal mining camp, there was a colored camp, if you will, and there was a black church in Kenford that apparently Pastor Bates had got into contact with. Ed Johnson was not present at the assembly in 1924, but the church letter was presented and was received into the fellowship, the first African American congregation in the Church of God Mountain Assembly. The following year, Pastor Johnson did attend the 1925 assembly, and he was selected by the Divine Services Committee to preach on Wednesday night, September the 2nd, 1925, along with Pastor Matt Morgan of the Jellicoe Creek Church. They tag team. Pastor Morgan preached, and then Pastor Ed Johnson became the first African American to preach at the Church of God Mountain Assembly General Assembly.
And this was in 25?
1925. In some ways, we're ahead of race relations, right? I mean, it would appear. They preached on the highway. Messages in tongues with interpretations of tongues, showing God's favor with the Church of God, instructing people to take their means, what belonged to God, and give to Him instead of pleasing the flesh as some had. Church lettered in for the next 2 or 3 years and then disappeared from the pages of history. I'm trying to find out something about that church, trying to find out something about that congregation and that minister, trying to track down. I'm doing detective work in so many areas right now that just don't have the time resources to do that. But in 1945, Thomas Jackson brought his church in Toledo, Ohio, into the Church of God Mountain Assembly. He was approved that year by the elder board for ordination. What year was that? 1945. And on Wednesday night that year, Coy Laws preached, and then afterwards, Clayton Lawson was supposed to preach, but Clayton wanted to defer and give our brother from Toledo the opportunity to preach in his stead, and so Thomas Jackson became the second African American to preach at the General Assembly, brought a wonderful message which edified, was a blessing to the large congregation, using as a text, the name of the Lord is a strong tower, the righteous run into it and are safe. Thomas Jackson was also appointed to be the state overseer for the state of Ohio for the black churches in the state of Ohio. Of course, his was the only church in the organization, but and we were segregated. But at the same time, you can see that there was some steps toward getting it right. I assumed that was the case. And Clayton Lawson, of course, had got saved in Cincinnati and was pastoring and preaching in Cincinnati. Clayton was not afraid. I mean, his church was biracial, at least to some degree. 15th and Race Street Church. You ever get a chance to go downtown, to see where it's at now? Of course, the city has grown, what have you. But I mean, it's in the heart of downtown. Clayton was not intimidated at all by the presence of African Americans, and I think his offering of his pulpit, his preaching time to a person of color, suggests he was very interested. Clayton was interested in growing any way that we could grow, and if there's a field that's ripe, ready to harvest, then so be it. It would be 1973 before a black man would preach at the assembly again. When Elder Blair from Jamaica would bring the message. Several since then. Talk about CGMA and gender. In 1948, the Assembly adopted a directive for the local churches known as the Ladies Willing Workers Band. The organization was designed to promote weekly meetings of the sisters of the church. Its primary purpose seems to have been to create a way to raise funds for church programs as they saw fit. Each local church shall organize and maintain an auxiliary which should be generally known as the Ladies Willing Workers Band. Officers of said organizations shall consist of a president, vice president, and secretary and treasurer, which organization shall be under the jurisdiction of the pastor. The purpose of said organization is to meet each week or as often as convenient to engage in such legitimate pursuits as may seem profitable, to raise funds to be dispersed on behalf of the local church needs. It is further understood that each local organization, after consulting with their pastor, may disperse their funds according to their best judgment. Where an organization of this type is already functioning under a different name, it may continue to do so if they so desire. And so a ladies' auxiliary in the local church was created to promote and to stir up interest in the local church among the sisters of the church. Now, it will be another 30 years before it goes national. But we'll get to that, I promise, in the days to come. Another major change that took place around the same time as 1948. In 1949, the Assembly voted to allow women preachers the opportunity to become licensed ministers, with the provision that women ministers could not pastor, could not baptize, and could not administer the Lord's Supper. So all the things that a licensed minister is able to do, women ministers can't do, but they can't have the card. And so 1949, that became a policy. The next year, there were 2 women listed among those who were licensed evangelists. Jessie Farrell and Edith Frederick were the first 2 women licensed ministers in the Church of God Mountain Assembly. The rest of my time is going to be spent talking about building for the future in the youth ministry. Church of God Mountain Assembly and youth ministry. 1948, Alice Ellis Gibson called the delegates to order for business, and the first matter of business was to appoint a committee of 3 to work out a plan for the young people. The committee of 3 was Luther Gibson, M.E. Woolham, and R.N. Ballinger. And the following day they presented 2 paragraphs outlining their work. Basically in the same way that the ladies' auxiliary was created that year and to function in the local church, there was a young people's endeavor that was created, that each local church was encouraged to have some sort of a young people's endeavor, a young people's meeting for the benefit of our young people. The biggest difference between the ladies' auxiliary and the youth department was it went national the first year. And so right away, they realized what we need is somebody coordinating this on a national level. And so the General Assembly accepted the proposal, providing for a national youth director and his assistant, who would be responsible for drafting national, state, and local youth programs. He would be responsible for Sunday school promotion and for circulation of the Gospel Herald. The young people's endeavor was given the Friday night service at the General Assembly for a rally night, and 19-year-old Edward Woolham led the service, served as the first National Youth Director. 16-year-old Robert Thomas of Somerset, Kentucky, preached the evening message. Edward Woolham was the National Youth Director, and his assistant was a man named Floyd Jordan. Floyd Jordan was the youth leader, young people's teacher in Middlesboro, Kentucky, and he is a celebrity by all of those that are still living, that are old enough to remember him. One of the first things that they did was organize, and help churches organize youth services, local youth meetings, and regional meetings. The very first district youth rally in the Church of God Mountain Assembly was held on a Sunday afternoon, October the 17th, 1948. So next Tuesday night will be the 69th anniversary of the first district youth rally in the Church of God Mountain Assembly. It was held during the Kentucky State Camp Meeting in Middlesboro, Kentucky. A district youth program constructed here, and then later on similar meetings were soon held in Dayton, Ohio and Cincinnati, Ohio. At a ministers' meeting in Jellicoe on March 12, 1949, Robert Thomas was appointed National Youth Director with 22-year-old Johnny Longsworth of Sidney, Ohio as his assistant. The youth department had adopted a motto: "We will not stop until our good is better and our better is best." They had state youth directors in 4 states. In 1949, at the General Assembly, Johnny Longsworth became the National Youth Director and served for the next 2 years. By 1951, the local and district youth departments became more organized, and so it was time to expand on what they already had. And so a committee was formed at the Assembly in 1951. The committee was Euless Graham, Lawrence Redmond, and Earl Heath, and C.B. Ellis Jr., 4 men. They presented 7 new directives to be added to the YPE resolution. So it provided for state youth directors and state youth rallies, and directives on how to separate the money for those rallies between the national and the district level. It called for having northern and southern national youth rallies. Later in 1951, Lawrence Redmond was appointed National Youth Director. We said at this time the appointment of district overseers and the appointment of National Youth Director, anything that wasn't elected by the delegation, wasn't specified in the resolutions that it was elected by the delegation, were appointed by the appointing board. And the appointing board was the executive committee. It was the general overseer, the assistant overseer, and the general secretary and treasurer. And so they would appoint district overseers, they would appoint the national youth directors. And so, I don't know why we change so often in the middle of the assembly year, what have you, but maybe it's for a variety of reasons, but we did. 1952, at the General Assembly, Haskell Swain of Covington, Kentucky, was appointed to be National Youth Director. Effort Enix was his assistant. And just a couple of years later, Haskell Swain began publishing the Youth Gateway, a magazine, a national magazine for young people. Problem with the Youth Gateway was it seemed to compete with the Gospel Herald. Remember, the National Youth Director originally was responsible for securing Gospel Herald subscriptions. Now he started a magazine that's competing with it, and it got to the place where the Youth Gateway was becoming so popular, people were canceling their subscription to the Gospel Herald. It was discontinued in 1955. Haskell Swain decided that what he was going to do was, in order to promote subscriptions, he had a contest. Whoever sold the most subscriptions, he was going to give away a car. Somebody, it wasn't a brand new car, somebody had donated a car to be given away. And so, and so at the end of the contest, there was a tie. But he only had one car. And so Solomon couldn't cut it in half and give it to both of them. They couldn't get another car, so they gave it to neither of them. And needless to say, the feedback that the assembly got over that was not good. And the Youth Gateway combined with the Gospel Herald, and the Gospel Herald was increased to 4 pages, or increased 4 more pages, and a Youth Gateway section was added. By the way, in 1954, while Haskell Swain was National Youth Director, 9 more directives were added to the YWC resolution, including the offices of district ambassadors and boosters and reporters and leaders, a Bible question board, and several other things that I'm too ignorant to tell you how they worked or functioned or what exactly the purpose was. 1955, Everett Enix became the National Youth Director. Cecil Moses was his assistant, and he served for the next 7 years. The longest term for any National Youth Director. One of the greatest contributions of Everett Enix was in June of 1962 when the first National Youth Camp was held at Lake Matrina near Goshen, Ohio. Now, Goshen Pastor James Earl Pruitt was very instrumental in preparing and conducting the youth camp. The services were held at the Goshen Church, and it proved to be a success. Now, Fred Cornelius and the Monroe Church brought down all the teachers for the week, and so together, the Goshen and Monroe Church, the Aspinwall Church brought people down and put together. Efford was the National Youth Director. Efford got the credit, but Efford didn't have to do much of the planning or promoting at all, thanks to the pastors and the churches that took the ball and ran with it. In 1962, 2 significant changes took place in the office of National Youth Director. For the first time, he was elected by the delegation. Instead of being appointed by the appointing board, he would be elected by the delegation. And he also, for the first time, received a supplemental salary of $70 a week. In case you don't know what a supplemental salary is, that means you get $70 a week if you bring it in. If you raise it. So his job, he had to raise his own salary, get out and preach, and what have you. And if $70 came in that week, then you got $70. That week, that August, Gene Douglas of Speedwell, Tennessee, became the first full-time National Youth Director, and Leon Petrie was his assistant. The following year, they switched places. Gene Douglas resigned and was elected Assistant National Youth Director. Leon Petrie was elected National Youth Director 1963. Both Gene Douglas and Leon Petrie continued the youth camps. Those 2 years, 63 and 64, those youth camps were held back at Camp Matrina near Goshen, Ohio. In 1965, Leon Petrie moved the youth camp into Indiana to Lake Placid near Hartford City, Indiana. Assemblies of God Campground is still in existence. They have developed it. It is absolutely incredible the way that they have developed it through the years. Just absolutely amazing. What a place they've got there in Hartford City. In 1968, Brother Petrie had the youth camp at Buford, Ohio, at Camp Cannon, and at campgrounds that we had the opportunity to purchase. 100 acres, all of it flat, most of it being farmed. It's all developed. 100 acres, we were going to get the opportunity to purchase for right at $100 an acre. $10,000. We were going to be able to purchase this piece of property. It had horses and stables. The owners were going to buy the horses back. Let us keep the stables. There was a crop, they'd sublet some of the area. There was a crop of corn. They were going to buy the crop back. Give us money back on it. There was also a swimming pool. And that's what killed the deal. They actually had swimming that year, 1916. They actually had swimming. They had it set up to where that the fence around the pool, they put up sheets and blankets and stuff to make it private. The only problem was if you were in the boys' dorm during the day, you could look straight down into where the pool was at. So they did everything they could to keep the boys out of the dorm during the day while the girls were swimming. And but there was I'm told there was a little girl that left the swimming area wearing a bathing suit. One of the elders saw her in a bathing suit, and we took back the money that we put down in earnest on the property, and instead set our sights on Highland County, Ohio. At the General Assembly in 1968, Kokomo, Indiana, Pastor Jasper Walden was elected National Youth Director. Donnie Hill was his assistant. That same year, the General Assembly approved the purchase of 38 acres in Highland County, Ohio. That 38 acres was not nearly as developed. In fact, it was a hillside that was covered with trees and underbrush, and needed a backhoe or a bush hog right away. But we paid, I think, around $4,000 for it, if I'm not mistaken. I have to go back and double check that.
Is that the current?
That's where we're at now. They bought the campgrounds. And Brother Walden had camp for the next several years at Ludlow Falls near Troy, Ohio, while he spent the following 6 years raising funds and preparing for the building of the campgrounds. In 1970, at the General Assembly, a motion was made by Brother Glenn Rowe that we build a campgrounds on the property that we had purchased, and the fundraising began. J.E. Pruitt made a motion that lots be drawn up on the grounds to lease to members or the churches for the building of cabins or dormitories. The idea was we'll sell these lot leases, we'll lease the land for a 100-year lease, $315 per lot, 100 lots, that's $31,000 right off the bat to develop the property with. That was the idea behind it. On November 1970, on a Friday night, 1975 Northern National Youth Rally, 100 lots went on sale, and the General Overseer C.D. Ellis signed the first lease on his lot. By the summer of 1976, enough money had been raised to build a cafeteria, a bathhouse, and a sewage treatment plant. And so that June, the first National Youth Camp was held on property that was owned by the Church of God Mountain Assembly. 1976. Under the direction of Donnie Hill, National Youth Director from 1974 to 78. Again, no church building, no tabernacle, so a tent was used for the church services. And Monday night, Ray Landis preached, "This is God's place." And even though it poured the rain all week long and everybody was staying in tents and campers, we were excited to be on our own campgrounds. Donnie was assisted by J.E. Lay and by Mike Barty. During his time, the development of the campgrounds continued with a dining hall being finished, a shower house, Dormitories were built. The Indiana District built a dormitory. Aspinwall Church, Rittman Church, the Town Street Church, the Goshen Church, and the Floral Avenue Church built dormitories on the campgrounds. 1977, the General Assembly created a National Camp Board. Dave Cornelius, Earl Pruitt, and Ray Freeman served as the first camp board. Purpose was to oversee the development of the property and the policies of the camp program. In 1978, Danny Jones of Kokomo, Indiana, was elected National Youth Director. Dave Cornelius from Nevada, Indiana, his assistant. One of the greatest accomplishments in the National Youth Department's history, 1979, Danny's first year as the camp director, he had 2 weeks of camp, and including the first youth camp, young people. Up until this time, camp was for everybody. Everybody came to camp. Families all came together, and they had classes and activities for the kids, but everybody was there. Danny said, you know what would be good for young people is if all we had here was young people. Maybe a handful of counselors to oversee them, keep them in line, but we'll get somebody to come in, preach to the young people, directly to the young people, and we won't have all the adults here to distract them. They can get into church services and seek God for themselves. So that first year, 84 people were saved and 40 were baptized with the Holy Ghost. The church services in those days were held inside the cafeteria. Again, no tabernacle. 1980, Mike Barty was elected He built the tabernacle. 1984 to 1988, Dennis McClanahan served as National Youth Director, finishing up the Tabernacle project, which included VIP rooms around the sides. He was assisted by Randy Van Hoos and Rick Massengill.
What's the relation between Mike and Tim?
Cousins. They're dads or brothers. 1988 to 1994, Rick Massengill became National Youth Director, and the job changed. You'll have to read about that because I don't have time to give it to you. He actually, his title became the National Youth Ministries and Camp Development Director. His job was both the development of the camp property and the National Youth Program. He was assisted 1 year by Mike Manning and 5 years by James Walden Jr. II. Forgive the typographical error. In 1994, Wayne Halcomb was elected National Youth Director. Shortly after the assembly, he resigned, and Kenny Ellis, who had been elected the assistant, became the National Youth Director. He would serve in that capacity for 4 years. His assistant was Jay Walden, and Brother Walden was elected in 1998. He was assisted for 2 years by Michael Padgett, and by 4 years by Nicholas Hill. Nick Hill was elected in 2004 for a term as National Youth Director, assisted by John Walden. John Walden was elected to his own tenure in 2006 until 2010. He was assisted by Reverend Jeff Hill. 2010, James Coffey was elected National Youth Director. He served in that capacity until his resignation in the fall of 2013. His assistant, Reverend Doug Walden, became National Youth Director in 2013. In 2013, the Executive Board and the Finance Committee got together and presented the opportunity for Pastor Doug Walden to be paid part-time for the work and allowed to continue to pastor the church in Ferguson, Kentucky. And so for the remainder of that year till the 2014 assembly, Brother Doug served as National Youth Director while pastoring the church, National Youth Director on a part-time basis. There was a resolution presented that year to the assembly that it become a part-time position, as a temporary, on a trial basis for a 2-year period. In 2016, that 2-year period was extended and currently is set to expire in 2018. So without any resolution to make any changes, then we'll go back to a full-time National Youth Director in August. In 2015, after Brother Doug Walden had been elected pastor of the Goshen Church, he resigned as National Youth Director at the General Assembly that week, and Reverend Scott Landis, who had been his assistant, was elected to that position, and he remains to this day, continuing to be assisted by Randy Halpern. Any questions on anything that I've talked about during this time tonight?
At what point, I know now we have it part-time, but before it was full-time, but at what point did the National Youth Director not have to live at camp? Because there is a home, there is a house there, correctly, where the youth director would live on site, help with raising the funds, and then, watching over and the grounds and all that type of stuff. When did that shift?
What happened was in 1978, the Church of God Mountain Assembly created the position of North Overseer. And the first assistant overseer was the mission director, and he was the conference overseer of the southern churches. The northern conference overseer was the overseer of the northern churches. That second assistant overseer, we bought a house in Tazewell, Tennessee, and moved it to Hillsboro, Ohio, or to the campgrounds there in Winchester, Ohio, to the campgrounds. And that double wide, that parsonage became the residence of the second assistant overseer. And so Brother James O. Pruitt served for 2 years in that capacity. Then Reverend Ray Landis served for 2 years in that capacity. And then Mike Cornelius was elected for 2 years in that capacity. And during that time, when Mike Cornelius was elected, the job changed. He was no longer the northern, we got rid of the northern and southern conference overseers. The second assistant overseer became the camp development director. And so his job was to develop the campgrounds. And so he was required to continue to live there on that property. In 1988, we combined the office of second assistant overseer and camp development director with the job of National Youth Director, and created the office of National Youth Ministries and Camp Development Director, 1988. Rick Massagill was the first person to have that title, to serve in both of those capacities. And so the resolution that was drafted to create that position, combining them, required the National Youth Director to live at the campgrounds. Now, technically, according to the bylaws, the trial basis that we've been in since 2014, that trial basis doesn't require the National Youth Director to live at the campgrounds. When the resolution expires, when the trial basis expires in 2018, and we have a full-time National Youth Director again, we revert back to again, without a resolution to the contrary, when we go back to the old plan requires the National Youth Director to live at the campgrounds. Now,
It's changed by resolution.
right, has to be changed by resolution. We'll have a full-time National Youth Director who's required to maintain residency there in Hillsboro, Ohio, without a resolution. My guess is there will be some sort of resolution presented to either make it permanent, stop with all the trial bases, or to do something to at least change the office, or there'll be something, I would imagine, submitted. And probably somebody in this room is leaning toward submitting some sort of resolution on the process. So, any other questions about any of this? All right, I again apologize. I'm talking a lot longer than what I intend to talk. I got too much going on, and I apologize for keeping you all out so late.